Uncle Silas was a man built of paranoia and rigid, unyielding routines. As a child, visiting his isolated cabin in the Appalachian Mountains felt less like a vacation and more like entering a military quarantine zone. He had rules, dozens of them, each stranger and more specific than the last. "Never hum or sing after the sun dips below the tree line," he would say, his voice a gravelly whisper. "Never leave a mirror uncovered in the room where you sleep. And the most bizarre of all, never, under any circumstances, apologize to the empty air. Even if you trip, even if you break something, keep your apologies to yourself." Whenever I stayed with him, I had to recite these rules before dinner. If I hesitated, his eyes would widen with a terrifying, manic intensity, and he would glance toward the locked door of his study. My mother always told me Silas had never been the same after the cave-in. In his 30s, he had been a deep-earth spelunker, mapping uncharted subterranean systems. He was trapped underground for 14 days after a collapse. When they finally dug him out, he was clutching a heavy reinforced glass cylinder, completely catatonic. He never spoke of what happened in the dark, but the rules began the day he came home. It wasn't until I was in my late 20s that I finally saw what he kept in the study. I had walked in unannounced to bring him a cup of coffee. He was standing in front of his desk, staring at the glass cylinder. Inside, suspended in a thick, amber-colored fluid, was something. It was pale, roughly the size of a human infant, with leathery, translucent skin. It had no eyes, just a smooth, pale dome where a face should be, and a mouth stitched shut by what looked like thick, black veins. Its long, multi-jointed limbs were curled inward, resembling a grotesque cross between a bat and a deep-sea spider. Silas grabbed my arm, his grip like a steel vise. "Do not look at it for too long, Arthur," he hissed, pulling me away. "It sleeps in the amber, but it listens. It is always listening for a crack in the rules." I thought he was just a broken old man, traumatized by the dark. I humored him. I followed his rules. But deep down, I believed the creature was nothing more than a weird, undiscovered, deep cave specimen. Dead. Harmless. Then, Uncle Silas passed away. His will was simple. The cabin, the land, and his meager savings were mine. But attached to the legal documents was a handwritten letter, penned in erratic, shaky ink. "Arthur, the rules weren't to protect me. They were to keep it asleep. I am gone, and the anchor is broken. You must take the cylinder to the old iron smelter at the edge of the property. Throw it into the furnace. Lock the heavy iron door. Burn it until the glass melts to slag. Do not wait for nightfall. Do not break the rules. Promise me, Arthur. Get rid of it." Standing in the dusty, quiet cabin on a Tuesday afternoon, holding that letter, a profound wave of grief and exhaustion washed over me. The sky outside was already bruised with the dark purple clouds of an approaching storm. Thunder rumbled in the distance, low and threatening. I walked into the study. The room was freezing. The glass cylinder sat on the mahogany desk, heavy and imposing. The amber fluid inside seemed darker than I remembered, almost murky. The pale, eyeless creature was perfectly still. I reached out and touched the glass. It was ice cold, sending a sharp prickle up my fingertips. "All right, Uncle Silas," I whispered to myself. "I'll do it. I'll burn it." I grabbed an old canvas duffel bag and carefully slid the heavy cylinder inside. The storm outside broke with sudden violence. Rain lashed against the windows like handfuls of gravel. The wind howled through the pines, a deafening roar that shook the old cabin. I walked to the front door, shivering. The nearest iron smelter was a half-mile hike through dense woods. In this torrential downpour and fading light, the trek would be treacherous. Mudslides were common here. If I slipped and dropped the bag, the glass could shatter. "It can wait until morning," I muttered, setting the heavy bag down on the floor near the coat rack. "It's been dead in a jar for 40 years. One more night won't matter." I decided to stay in the cabin. The silence of the house, punctuated only by the aggressive storm, felt oppressive. To break the tension, I turned on the old kitchen radio, but there was only static. To soothe my own nerves, I began to unpack my groceries, absent-mindedly humming a soft, jazzy tune my mother used to play. I hummed as I organized the pantry. I hummed as I watched the last sliver of the sun disappear behind the jagged silhouettes of the trees, plunging the cabin into the gray gloom of twilight. Rule number 1: broken. I didn't realize it at the time. I was too focused on getting a fire started in the living room hearth. The cabin was growing uncomfortably cold, a damp chill that seemed to seep straight into my bones. After eating a quick, quiet dinner, I went to the bathroom to wash my face. The mirror above the sink was covered with an old, floral-patterned towel. Silas covered all the mirrors. Chuckling at the old man's paranoia, I pulled the towel down and tossed it into the laundry basket. I splashed cold water on my face, staring at my tired reflection, the dark circles under my eyes. I left the bathroom, leaving the mirror bare, reflecting the empty, dark hallway behind me. Rule number 2: broken. I settled onto the living room sofa with a book, trying to ignore the storm, but the air in the cabin felt thick. It felt like the pressure inside a descending airplane. My ears popped. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees. I could see my own breath pluming in the dim light of the fireplace. From the hallway, near the front door where I had left the duffel bag, I heard a sound. Tap, tap, scrape. I froze. The book slipped slightly in my hands. Tap, scrape, sploosh. It sounded like something heavy and wet shifting inside thick liquid. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. I stood up slowly, the floorboards groaning under my weight. "Is someone there?" I called out. My voice sounded thin, swallowed instantly by the vast, suffocating silence of the cabin. The storm outside seemed entirely muted now, as if the house had been severed from the outside world. I grabbed a heavy iron fire poker from the hearth and crept toward the entryway. The canvas duffel bag sat exactly where I left it, but it was wet. A dark, viscous puddle was spreading across the wooden floorboards, seeping from the fabric. It smelled like copper, rotting kelp, and ozone. My breath hitched. The glass hadn't broken. I hadn't dropped it. Why was it leaking? I knelt down, my hands trembling uncontrollably, and reached for the zipper of the bag. The moment my fingers brushed the metal, the bag lurched violently. I stumbled backward, knocking over a tall wooden coat rack. It crashed to the floor, shattering an antique ceramic vase that had sat on the side table. Pieces of porcelain scattered everywhere in the dark. "Ah, damn it," I gasped, clutching my chest. Out of pure, ingrained politeness and sheer panic, the words slipped out of my mouth before I could stop them. "I'm so sorry." Rule number 3: broken. The temperature in the room plummeted to freezing. The fire in the hearth extinguished instantly, leaving only the pale, ghostly moonlight filtering through the rain-streaked windows. The puddle of dark fluid on the floor began to move. It wasn't just leaking, it was flowing upward, defying gravity, spiraling into the air like black smoke. From inside the canvas bag, a sound emerged. It wasn't the sound of an animal, it was the sound of a human throat, dry and tearing, trying to mimic a laugh. Ka, 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 ka. The zipper on the bag slowly slid open by itself. The heavy glass cylinder rolled out onto the floor. It was completely empty. The amber fluid was gone. The creature was gone. I backed away, my knuckles white as I gripped the iron poker. "No," I whispered. "No, no, no. It's a trick of the light." I backed into the hallway, my eyes darting to every corner, every shadow. As I passed the bathroom, I caught movement in the corner of my eye. I turned my head to look into the bare mirror I had uncovered earlier. The bathroom wasn't empty. Standing directly behind my reflection was the creature. It was no longer the size of an infant. It towered near the ceiling, its pale, translucent skin pulled taut over unnaturally long, jutting bones. Its limbs ended in sharp, chitinous points. But the most terrifying thing was its face. The black veins stitching its mouth shut had snapped open. It wasn't looking at my reflection. It was looking out of the mirror, directly at me. Suddenly, I realized the fluid hadn't leaked out of the jar. The house itself was filling with it. The air was becoming impossibly thick, suffocating, turning the color of dark amber. My movements became sluggish, as if I were submerged deep underwater. I tried to scream, but the thick, cold air poured down my throat, stealing my voice. Through the mirror, the creature reached a long, pale, multi-jointed arm forward. Its sharp claw tapped gently against the glass from the inside. Tap, tap. Then it pushed. The creature didn't step out of the mirror. Instead, the world twisted. A violent, nauseating inversion of space. I felt myself being pulled violently forward, crashing headfirst into the glass, but I didn't hit the sink. I fell into cold, viscous fluid. I thrashed wildly, my lungs burning, opening my eyes to stinging, murky darkness. I looked out. I was looking through a curved wall of thick glass. Beyond the glass, I saw the hallway of Uncle Silas's cabin. Standing there, wearing my clothes, looking exactly like me, was the creature. It adjusted its collar, tilting its head in a jerky, unnatural motion. It looked directly into the glass cylinder where I was now floating, drowning in the amber fluid. The thing wearing my face walked over, picked up the heavy cylinder, and smiled a wide, stitched smile. "Never apologized to the empty air," my own voice echoed, muffled through the thick glass as it zipped the canvas bag shut, leaving me in the absolute, suffocating dark. Elias Thorne made his living, breathing life into the dead. As a forensic audio archivist, his days were spent in the windowless, dust-choked basement of a sprawling London University building. He was surrounded by towers of obsolete technology, heavy reel-to-reel players, intricate DAT machines, and stacked cassette decks that smelled of ozone and old plastic. His job was a race against time, digitizing, degrading magnetic tape before the audio, and the voices trapped within it were lost to the ether forever. He was a solitary man, one who preferred the predictable company of ghosts caught in static over the messy, unpredictable nature of living, breathing people. On a damp Tuesday in late November, a courier delivered a heavily taped cardboard box from the estate of a recently deceased psychiatrist, Dr. Julian Vance. Inside, nestled in bubble wrap, was a battered Nagra 3 field recorder and a single, unmarked spool of quarter-inch magnetic tape. The accompanying estate notes were brief, simply requesting that the audio be cleaned, enhanced, and digitized for the family's private records. Elias carefully threaded the fragile tape through the intricate mechanical labyrinth of the Nagra, the metallic clatter of the heavy machine echoing sharply in his quiet, acoustically treated studio. He placed his high-fidelity headphones over his ears, clicked his mouse to begin recording on his digital audio workstation, and pressed the heavy mechanical play button on the physical machine. At first, there was only the warm, comforting hiss of tape noise, the sound Elias jokingly referred to as the heartbeat of the past. Then, the muffled acoustic signature of a small room faded in. A heavy grandfather clock ticked rhythmically in the background. The sharp scrape of a wooden chair being pulled across a hard floor. Session 42, a man's voice stated. It was deep, authoritative, and distinctly clinical, presumably Dr. Jennery. Vance. The patient remains fixated on the auditory hallucinations. The medication seems to have had no effect. Let us begin. Tell me about the frequency, Thomas. A long, agonizingly tense silence followed. Elias kept his eyes on the waveform generating on his glowing monitor. It was a flat, jagged blue line, indicating nothing but the ambient room tone of the recording. Then, a second voice spoke. It was so faint, so terribly fragile and trembling, that Elias had to lean forward, reaching for the gain knob on his analog mixer to push the volume up. It's not a frequency, doctor, the patient, Thomas whispered, his breath catching in his throat. It's a rhythm, like someone dragging dry fingertips across the inside of a snare drum. It only happens when the room is completely silent, and when I close my eyes, I can hear it stepping closer. There is no one else in your house, Thomas, the doctor replied, his tone laced with a practiced, dismissive patience. It is a manifestation of your severe anxiety. Your mind is filling the silence with your worst fears. You don't understand. Thomas's voice cracked, suddenly rising in absolute primal panic. It doesn't live in the house. It lives in the quiet. It's waiting for the noise to stop. Suddenly, the tape violently popped. A sharp, ear-splitting spike of audio feedback pierced Elias's eardrums, causing him to cry out and physically rip the heavy headphones off his head. He rubbed his aching temples, his heart hammering in his chest, and stared at the digital monitor. The waveform on the screen hadn't spiked at all. According to the visual digital data, the tape was completely silent during the screech. Frowning and rubbing his sore ears, Elias cautiously put the headphones back on, keeping the master volume significantly lower this time. He grabbed his mouse, scrubbed the digital track back 30 seconds, and played the audio again. The conversation between the doctor and the patient was completely gone. Elias froze in his chair. Magnetic tape didn't just selectively erase itself on playback, unless the playhead of the machine was heavily magnetized, something he checked and cleaned meticulously every single morning. He watched the physical spools spinning smoothly on the Nagra deck. Instead of the psychiatric session, an entirely new sound filled his ears. It was a slow, rhythmic, scratching noise. Skirk, pause, skirk, pause. Just like the terrified patient had described the unmistakable sound of dry, cracked fingertips dragging against a taut drum skin. A cold sweat broke out across Elias's forehead. He reached out and slammed his finger onto the pause button of the Nagra. The spinning metal spools came to a hard, mechanical stop. The digital recording software paused its timeline on the monitor. But inside Elias's headphones, pressed tight against his ears, the scratching sound continued. Skirk, pause, skirk. His breath hitched. He tore the headphones off again, and threw them onto the wooden desk. The studio was dead silent. The heavy, foot-thick acoustic soundproofing of the room ensured that not a single decibel of the busy London street above could penetrate the walls. The scratching had stopped the very millisecond the headphones left his ears. "Just static discharge," Elias muttered to himself, his voice sounding entirely too loud, almost desperate, in the dead room. "It's just a grounding issue in the old hardware." He reached out toward the mixing desk to physically unplug the headphones from the jack. But the moment his bare fingers brushed the black plastic casing of the ear cups, a voice bled out of the small speakers. It wasn't the arrogant doctor. It wasn't the terrified patient. It was a voice that sounded utterly inhuman, like grinding stones, wet earth, and something incredibly old. "I can see the back of your head, Elias." Elias stumbled backward, his rolling chair tipping over and crashing violently onto the linoleum floor. He stared, wide-eyed, at the headphones resting on the desk. They were completely disconnected from the amplifier now. The thick coiled cable was dangling freely in the air. Yet, a slow, heavy exhalation, a wet, rattling breath, hissed steadily from the small drivers. He didn't stay a second longer to investigate. He grabbed his heavy winter coat, scrambled out the door, and slammed the heavy acoustic vault shut behind him, locking it with shaking hands. He practically ran up the concrete stairs to the street level. As he stepped out into the freezing, pouring London rain, the chaotic noise of traffic washing over him, he desperately convinced himself it was just auditory fatigue. He had been working 80-hour weeks. His sleep-deprived brain was simply filling in the blanks of the white noise, playing cruel tricks on him. He couldn't bring himself to go back to the basement. Elias took a week of emergency leave. He stayed locked inside his modern, high-rise apartment on the 22nd floor, making sure he was constantly surrounded by the comforting, unending hum of the city below. He kept his large television on at all times, volume turned up. He played upbeat jazz on his wireless smart speakers throughout the day. He absolutely refused to let the apartment fall into complete silence. By the 6th day, the terrifying memory of the basement studio began to feel like a distant, absurd nightmare. He actually laughed at his own paranoia as he stood in his brightly lit kitchen preparing dinner. He was chopping vegetables while listening to an engaging history podcast on his phone, which was synced to his apartment's expensive Bluetooth audio system. It happened at precisely 9:14 p.m. The jovial, fast-paced voice of the podcast host suddenly slowed down. The pitch dropped, dragging into a deep, unintelligible, demonic baritone before dissolving completely into that horrifyingly familiar, rhythmic scratching. Skirk. Pause. Skirk. Elias dropped his chef's knife. It clattered loudly against the granite countertop, making him jump. He stared at his phone resting on the island. The screen was on, and the podcast app clearly showed that the audio was paused. Yet, the sound continued to pump relentlessly through the high-end speakers mounted in the corners of his ceiling. Skirk, skirk, skirk. It was faster now. More urgent. More aggressive. "Stop," Elias said aloud, his voice trembling uncontrollably. "Hey Siri, stop playback." The smart home system chimed obediently, a cheerful green light pulsing on the central hub sitting on the shelf. But the speakers didn't obey the command. Instead, the scratching evolved. It became a wet, heavy, slapping sound, like large, bare, damp feet walking slowly across a hardwood floor. The horrifying sound was panning across the stereo field of his apartment. It started in the left speaker by the windows, moved to the center speaker above the living room, and then slowly transitioned to the right speaker, which was positioned directly above the dark hallway leading to his bedroom. Then, the smart hub's automated light turned a sickly, deep red. The voice that spoke wasn't the default, friendly robotic assistant. It was the grinding, earthen voice from the basement studio. "You left the door open, Elias. You left the tape running. You let me out of the quiet." Every single light in the apartment flickered violently and died. The comforting hum of the refrigerator ceased. The ambient noise of the city outside his massive windows seemed to instantly vanish, replaced by an oppressive, suffocating, absolute darkness. Elias backed up slowly against the kitchen counter, his hands frantically searching his pockets for his phone. He grabbed it, his thumb desperately mashing the screen to activate the flashlight. The stark, blinding white beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the long hallway. Nothing. The apartment appeared completely empty. He moved forward slowly, inch by inch, the beam of his phone trembling violently in his slick hands. He needed to get to the front door. He needed to get out into the brightly lit hallway of the building. As he crept past the living room, the beam of his flashlight swept across the large, black, powered-down screen of his flat-screen television mounted on the wall. Elias stopped dead in his tracks. The dark glass of the television acted as a black mirror, reflecting the room behind him. In the reflection, the beam of his phone clearly illuminated the wall. But the reflection of Elias himself was entirely wrong. In reality, Elias was standing stiffly, his shoulders hunched, holding the phone out in front of him like a weapon, his breathing rapid, shallow, and terrified. In the dark reflection of the TV screen, the Elias was standing completely relaxed. His posture was casual. His arms were hanging limply at his sides, and he was smiling. It wasn't a normal human smile. The corners of his mouth stretched far too wide, the jaw unhinging slightly, revealing pale, wet gums and rows of teeth that caught the reflected light of the phone. Elias let out a choked, terrified gasp and dropped the phone. The device clattered to the hardwood floor, the flashlight beam spinning wildly before settling, casting long, erratic, moving shadows across the ceiling. Slowly, against every survival instinct screaming in his brain, Elias looked up from the floor, back up to the television screen. The reflection was no longer mirroring the dark room. The screen had turned itself on, emitting no light into the room, but displaying a grainy, high-definition live feed of his living room. The camera angle was impossible. It was looking down from the top right corner of the ceiling, exactly where the smart speaker was mounted. On the screen, Elias watched himself standing frozen in the middle of his dark apartment. And then, he saw the horror behind him. Crawling down the wall directly behind his back in the video feed, moving with the jerky, unnatural, disjointed grace of a massive insect, was a figure. It was impossibly tall, its limbs elongated, skeletal, and sickeningly pale. It was wearing a distorted, melting approximation of Elias's own face. Elias spun around in the real world, throwing his hands up to defend himself. The room was empty. There was nothing on the wall. He whipped his head back to the screen. The figure was on the floor now, standing directly behind the digital version of him. It raised a long, impossibly spindly finger, tipped with a cracked, yellowed nail, and pressed it against its lipless mouth in a slow, mocking, shushing motion. Then, Elias felt a freezing, wet, putrid breath against his right ear in the real world. "Did you think the physical world was safe?" the voice whispered. The sound wasn't coming from a speaker. It was vibrating directly inside his ear canal. "Media is just a window, Elias, and you pressed your face right up against the glass." Elias opened his mouth to scream, but the air was instantly sucked from his lungs. The darkness of the apartment violently collapsed inward, folding over him like a suffocating heavy blanket. The last physical sensation he felt was a pair of ice-cold, impossibly long hands wrapping securely around his throat, pulling him backward into a terrifying, weightless, endless void of white noise. When Elias finally opened his eyes, the warm overhead lights were back on. The familiar, low hum of the refrigerator had returned. The muffled sound of city traffic buzzed safely outside the window. He was sitting comfortably on his couch in the living room. He felt perfectly calm. More than calm, he felt a strange, hollow euphoria. He took a deep, slow breath, relishing the sensation of the air filling his lungs. He stood up smoothly, stretching his arms, and walked over to the kitchen counter where his phone lay perfectly placed next to the knife. He picked it up, turned the screen on, and smiled. Everything was perfect. He finally understood the quiet. Then he heard a sound, a very faint, muffled, desperate pounding. Elias, or whatever entity was now wearing. Elias's skin slowly turned and walked toward the large flat-screen television. The screen was completely off, acting once again as nothing more than a dark mirror. But deep inside the thick glass, far behind the reflection of the stylish apartment, something was trapped. It was the real Elias. He was pounding his bloody fists against the inside of the screen, his face twisted in a silent, agonizing scream, his eyes wide with the realization of an eternity of terror. He was surrounded by a swirling, endless vortex of deafening white static, his physical form glitching and degrading into blocky digital artifacts with every frantic strike against the glass. The new Elias tilted his head, his face entirely expressionless, studying the frantic, trapped phantom like a bug in a jar. He slowly raised a hand and gently tapped his dry fingertips against the cold outside glass of the television screen. Skirk, pause, skirk. He smiled that impossibly wide, unhinged smile, picked up the television remote control from the coffee table, and pressed the power button. The screen flashed a blinding bright white, and then instantly faded to absolute impenetrable black. The pounding stopped completely. Elias grabbed his keys and walked out of the apartment, ready to enter the loud, bustling world of the living, leaving the ghost in the machine to scream forever in the absolute unbreakable quiet.